All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today we are joined by Dr. Burcin Unel from the New York University School of Law, and she is the Energy Policy Director at the Institute for Policy Integrity. And she's going to talk to us today about New York's clean energy transition and how that can help us in New Jersey transition to a clean energy. On the screen, we have our upcoming seminars. This one is from last seminar, so it's a little out of date. I apologize, but you can see on December 11th, we have Dr. Rebecca Boehm's going to join us, and then we have next semester's speakers getting lined up. So we have Dr. Berger, who will join us on February 11th. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Unel.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Thank you and Rachel and Frank for having me. It's a pleasure being here. As Kevin said, I'm the Energy Policy Director at the Institute for Policy Integrity. Policy Integrity is a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to improving the quality of we are quite involved in policy makings, both at the state level and the federal level. So today I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what New York is doing in several different sectors. So I'll be throwing out a lot of information, and then I will talk about my insights from, what worked, what didn't work, what could be done better in terms of both policy making and these levers for decarbonization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about state goals, both in New Jersey and New York, and I'm sure you're familiar with what New Jersey is doing. And then I'm going to go into different sectors and what New York State or New York City are doing in these different sectors. And then I will talk about some policy synergies or the conflicts that have arrived. Please feel free to jump in and ask questions. I know I will be, speeding through a lot of things because New York has a lot of things going on. But please feel free to jump in and ask questions if you have specific questions. So kind of an overview of what New York is trying to do and what New Jersey is trying to achieve. I'm sure you're all aware of New Jersey's Climate Act, 100% clean energy by 2050. There is carbon neutral electricity, 100% carbon neutral electricity goal. And at the same time, there is transportation. There is important weight put on transportation, electrifying transportation and building sectors. New York's goals are similar. Some of them are more on expedited timeline. For the electricity sector, especially, there is a 100% clean electricity goal by 2040. And a kind of interim goal is that 70% renewable has 70% renewable. It has to be 70% renewable by 2030. And just to give you a context, right now, about 30% of New York's generation comes from nuclear, 20% comes from hydro, there's about 5% of wind and other renewables, and then more than 40% comes from fossil fuel sources. And this 70% is not just clean, but it is renewable. So there is a huge ramp up that needs to happen. So in terms of emission sources, again, just to give you an idea, New Jersey, I stole from the Energy Master Plan, New Jersey's Energy Master Plan. A big chunk of emissions come from vehicles and buildings, and then electricity is relatively small compared to that. The same phenomenon happens in New York. Our electricity is relatively clean, but there is a big challenge for transportation and buildings. And with that being said, I am going to focus first on the electricity side of things because it will be the backbone, especially when we're talking about electrifying transportation and buildings. We need to make sure that the electricity system is clean so that we can maximize the benefits of electrifying. So on the wholesale, on the electricity market, New York has a lot of clean energy policies, a patchwork of clean energy policies. Actually, we have renewable energy credits. There are different tiers. There's tier 1 for new renewables, tier 2 for existing hydro. These are all for renewable and clean attributes of resources. But about 4 years ago, the New York Public Service Commission realized that this is not enough to achieve the clean energy goals of New York, particularly because of market conditions. Nuclear plants were thinking about exiting, and they did not want to lose the environmental attributes of clean non-emitting attributes of nuclear energy. So they created zero emission credits. This is a tier specific for nuclear generators, and New Jersey followed suit with some other states as well. Then to achieve offshore wind goals, again, they realized that just having one tier for all new renewables is not going to be sufficient. So now we have OREX, and just recently, within the last month, New York's clean energy standard has a new tier, and that is tier 4 for clean energy that can be delivered into New York City. If you're not familiar with New York State, um, our grid is, it is almost like two separate, two separate grids. We have upstate, where we have abundant renewable and clean resources and almost no congestion, and it can be non-emitting most of the time. And then we have downstate, where we have New York City, and there's a lot of congestion, and there's not enough room for, big wind farms or solar farms. So most of the electricity that is consumed in downstate is fossil fuel. So decarbonizing New York requires a little bit of targeted approach to solve New York City Zone J problem, and Tier 4 is an attempt at that. Then there are various incentives for energy storage and distributed energy resources. So of course, given that there are lots of patchwork of these policies, different tiers, these tiers are how these tiers are going to interact. They're all changing the relative prices of different renewable sources. That creates some complication. And at the same time, how these subsidies affect what electricity markets is, also has been a potential source of conflict, and actually has been quite the source of tension in state clean energy goals. So given these states' goals, what are the challenges for the clean energy transition? One is both New York and New Jersey belong to, wholesale energy markets. New York's grid operator, NYSO, and New Jersey belongs to PJM, which covers 13 states. So on that, New York is a little bit the better position because there is only one state in that grid. But still, aligning market outcomes with what state wants is a challenge. Wholesale markets, wholesale markets have been giving us reliable electricity, but the mix that we're getting from the current markets, our outcomes are clearly not the same as what the states have been wanting. So that has been a source of challenge, especially given that these grids are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It has been even more challenging under a Trump administration with Republican majorities who have been somewhat hindering to a little bit of state's clean energy progress. So there has been a lot of tension there between wholesale markets and and state goals, but that doesn't mean that markets cannot work. Obviously, the reason they, or at least for a biased economist like me, the reason those markets haven't worked is because we've never given a signal for a carbon price directly in these markets. So I think there are ways to align these outcomes, and it is important that we start thinking and implementing them now. Then the second challenge is, even if you have that price signal, we still need to rethink some of the market design issues. Scarcity pricing, because we know that wind and solar, they are variable, and they can change. The generation could change quickly, but there are ways to deal with it. Again, being an economist, we can think about scarcity pricing, or like giving some other price signals for flexibility. And with a lot of distributed energy resources, demand response, energy storage vehicles, we have a lot of flexible resources that can help in this transition, but we need to think about how the market rules are and how the pricing rules are. So we need to think about that. And then, of course, ensuring resource adequacy with the new resource mix is an important challenge. Yes, we all want 100% clean energy, but we also need to make sure that we have the capacity to meet the peak demand when it happens, whether it continues to be summer peak, or whether it continues to be summer peak, or whether it changes and switches to a winter peak with all the electrification transition. So along those lines, what is New York doing? The first thing on the aligning wholesale energy markets with state clean energy goals, NYSO has a carbon pricing proposal in the works. This has been a long process. So New York has a carbon pricing proposal, and this proposal directly incorporates a carbon price into dispatch. So the New York State sets a carbon price. The current analysis is done presuming that New York State is going to pick a price based on interagency working group social cost of carbon, and then adjusted for RGGI. So for reference, the social cost of carbon for 2020 is about $50. So New York NYSO would be adding about $45 to emitting generators that are subject to RGGI. And then NYSO will determine unit commitment, dispatch, and price formation based on these bids that incorporate this carbon charge. So essentially, emitting generators are going to pay for their emissions. Cleaner resources are going to receive higher revenues compared to a no carbon price world. And then if there is any carbon charge remains after that, that amount, that residual, is going to be credited back to the utilities. And on top of this carbon pricing, NYSO is also using a border adjustment mechanism to ensure that the emission leakage is minimized as much as possible. So this proposal, this has been in the works for quite some time, and it is kind of on pause because there has been a lot of uncertainty. So there is some uncertainty related to the state's position. The Governor's Cuomo's office has some hesitations about it, but there was also kind of like the biggest uncertainty is what would FERC do? Especially FERC under Trump administration, whether they would accept it or whether that will immediately reject it, which could create a lot of bad precedent. So there is some uncertainty about that. Just recently, FERC had a carbon pricing technical conference. That was a first for the commission. And following that carbon pricing conference, FERC released a proposed carbon pricing policy statement, which was essentially an invitation and open arms to proposals like NISO's, but that probably rattled some feathers, because just last week, Trump administration actually demoted current FERC chairman Neil Chatterjee and promoted Commissioner Danley to be a chairman, and we know that Chairman Danley's view on carbon pricing, that this is at least on pause until Biden administration takes over. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, and kind of the thinking is that any progress is going to depend on a Democratic FERC chair and a Democratic FERC taking over after the inauguration. All right, so this was what NYSO has been doing on kind of aligning wholesale markets. NYSO also has a very extensive grid and transition process. They've been thinking about, scarcity pricing, flexibility, hybrid resources. They've been thinking a lot about those, about how to incorporate more variable resources or new resources, aggregated distributed energy resources, etc. So they are really thinking through. Perhaps the most again, stressful topic is capacity markets and resource adequacy. And this stress applies both in New York and New Jersey. In New York, there were recent capacity market orders, which hampers state-sponsored resources' ability to participate in capacity markets. So essentially, these orders put a price floor on the offers of these resources into the auctions and can make it difficult for them to participate. And that will increase the cost of reaching clean energy goals of the state. And what is worse is, just again, a few weeks ago, there was another complaint submitted to FERC that these floors should apply to resources in all NYSO area, not just limited to New York City, where they were applying. So there's more tension building up related to these buyer side mitigation rules that could be problematic for New York's capacity market. And as a response, New York Public Service Commission opened up a docket on resource adequacy, and they are considering leaving the capacity market and looking at alternatives of whether it is to run their own auctions, have a separate, whether NYSERDA to do capacity auctions, or have another resource planning for resource adequacy. So there is a tension that has been brewing a lot in New York. What is the situation in New Jersey along these dimensions? As I mentioned, New Jersey belongs to PJM. PJM covers 13 states and DC, and each of these states have their own clean energy preferences, which makes New Jersey's job way more challenging in terms of both aligning wholesale market outcomes with state goals, as well as resource adequacy and other things that the grid operator needs to do to help achieve the energy future New Jersey wants. But it is not all hopeless. PJM also has a carbon pricing senior task force. So the focus in PJM is a little bit different because there are a lot of different states with varying values on carbon in states. And one of the main worries in PJM is that there are states that have carbon pricing, and New Jersey is rejoining RGGI, so there's an explicit price in several states. but there are also states that do not have a carbon price. And carbon pricing states are obviously worried about potential emissions leakage because of how grid operates. And there have been some concerns raised about emissions leakage. So a key focus of the carbon pricing senior task force in PJM is to look at this emission leakage and study whether there is a way to mitigate that. So I'm going to quickly show a slide from PJM analysis. They did some analysis of carbon pricing region and non-carbon pricing region in PJM's footprint. And the carbon pricing subregion includes states that either have a carbon price or thinking about having a carbon price, and then the rest of the RTO. You can see that, I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but you can see that in the carbon pricing region, when you put different carbon prices, emissions go down, but their analysis shows that there is some leakage to non-carbon pricing regions. Yet at the same time, you can see that overall RTO-wide emissions are still decreasing, but still there is concern that this leakage, and the PJM analysis has been looking at different ways to mitigate this leakage: border adjustment, one-way border adjustment versus two-way border adjustments. But this carbon pricing mostly focuses on these leakage issues and is not at the point where you can talk about a actual carbon price similar to what NYSO has been thinking about. And perhaps the most contentious issue related to clean energy in PJM is capacity markets. Again, capacity markets at FERC has recently ordered extending a minimum offer price rule. What is the minimum offer price rule? This was a rule that was intended to prevent market power in capacity markets. But about several years ago, there were complaints that all the state subsidies are causing price suppression in capacity markets. So they're making the capacity markets not just unreasonable. So these offers should be mitigated. FERC under Trump administration agreed with that reasoning and imposed a minimum offer price rule to all new and existing resources that get state subsidies. They have a really long explanation of what is a state subsidy and what is not. Essentially, all the clean energy resources that is in the Energy Master Plan, they're going to qualify under this really long definition. So why is this a problem? Again, just to give you an overview of how the capacity markets work, all the resources submit some bid to provide capacity, and the operator stacks them out and decides what the price is based on where that stack intersects the demand curve in the capacity market. So what MOPR does is that it replaces the capacity market offers of these subsidized resources with this number that the Commission thinks should be the bid of such a resource. For new resource, that is the net cost of new entry. So they think that this would be the money you would need from the capacity market if you want to enter. And this is essentially your cost of building minus the revenues you would earn from energy markets and ancillary markets. For existing resources, they will they think that your whatever capital you spent on building the generator or plant is already sunk, so you don't need to recover it. But there are some going forward costs that you will still need to recover if you want to stay in the market. So that increases essentially the bids of these resources that get subsidized and increases the price and changes the capacity market outcomes. Why is that a problem? Um, because this is just quickly, these are a little bit earlier numbers from earlier, but you should look at the last column on the right. So these are the net cone that the minimum, these are the bids that will replace generators' offers if they're getting state subsidies. So these numbers are, quite high numbers, but just to give you a benchmark number, PJM capacity prices have never exceeded $245 per megawatt day. So that has been the peak price in 2013-14. And with that price, you could see that most of these, nuclear or onshore or offshore wind, would not clear the capacity market auction. Based on the most recent auction in 2018, the top price was $204 per megawatt hour in the PSE and G zone. So you can see that all of these costs are higher than the prices that we have been observing. So it will definitely increase the cost of achieving state energy goals, not just because the capacity prices are going to be higher, but also it will lead to a different set of resources being procured in the capacity market, yet the state still having to subsidize more production of the resources that they want. So there will be maybe not, one-to-one double capacity, but there will be a capacity built out. What are the solutions that states have been considering? There is the fixed resource requirement that right now with New Jersey BPU is looking at. State pulling out of capacity markets is potentially an option. There are proposals submitted around forward clean energy markets where there's a better market construct instead of resource specific subsidies. And then there is, of course, carbon pricing. Again, I am biased towards having markets and carbon pricing. So my suggestion for New Jersey at this point would be that carbon pricing senior task force is a good opportunity for states to push for more aggressive carbon pricing and NISO style carbon pricing as opposed to just focusing on emissions leakage. Emission leakage is, clearly important and we should be thinking about it. But I think it will be a missed opportunity if states do not push for a higher, affirmative actual price in dispatch in this process. And especially given FERC's proposed carbon pricing policy statement, it is a it is a good sign that, especially starting January 20th, things could work in a way to align the wholesale market outcomes with state preferred outcomes in the most cost-effective way. Clearly, there is a capacity market reform needed, and this would have to be not just about MOPR, which is already under litigation, and then there could be complaints at FERC, again starting January, but also thinking about different aspects of capacity market reform, what the capacity market values are, whether you need seasonal capacity markets, etc. So there's a lot to think about there. And my observation is that PJM has been lagging, kind of behind of thinking through what the future requires. Same for price formation and other market design issues. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and the earlier PJM starts and the earlier New Jersey can push for those changes would be better. Okay, so wholesale markets was kind of complicated because the jurisdiction, regulatory jurisdiction, is at FERC, but New Jersey, the state, has jurisdiction over its distribution network, and there can still be a lot of things that are done at the distribution level simultaneously. On the distribution side of things, perhaps the biggest thing that happened in New York has been the reforming the energy vision proceeding. Again, this started 4 years ago, and there was certain things worked a lot, certain things were more challenging, and certain things ended up being just at the limbo. The goal of REV was to reorient the rate making and electric industry regulation with more consumer-centered approach. So developing more distributed energy resources market, maybe having a distributed system operator similar to a wholesale market operator, have active participation, and consumer participation, third-party participation, better rate making, performance-based regulations, like different goals, mechanisms for carbon reduction, peak reduction, etc. So it was very ambitious, and certain reforms I think were successful, and certain reforms are kind of have been more slow to materialize. One of the things that I thought REV did well was moving past net metering. So if you're not familiar with net metering is the most common form that rooftop solar or some other distributed energy resources get compensated. Basically, it is a credit on your bill based on your underlying retail electricity rate. Whatever you're paying, whatever you're paying for electricity, if you're injecting to the grid, you're getting exactly that rate. But the problem with that is we all know that the cost of generating electricity differs with time and location, but most consumers get flat rates. So there's a misalignment between the time and locational value of that electricity injection and the compensation that a consumer gets to net metering. So there's a potential for cost shifting. Also, most retail rates do not reflect externalities. So if your injection is avoiding a dirty oil peaker, that brings a lot of environmental value, but you don't get compensated for it. So essentially, net metering is inefficient to provide socially beneficial DER deployment. Ideally, we would need better rates, but in the meantime, probably reforming net metering is easier compared to reforming retail rates. At least that has been my observation, just looking at all the utility rate cases across the country. So how do we go past net metering? Value of distributed energy resources depend based on the benefits that they bring, and that varies both on the cost of energy at the time of injection, whether it is an on-peak or off-peak, whether the marginal unit is really emitting or not, whether you're at a congested distribution location or not. So this graph comes from one of Policy Integrity's report, and the left stack, the gray stack, shows what a NEM would pay for a generic rooftop injection, but the right stacks show you how those the actual value of that injection would vary between would change between, you know, peak and off peak in a small city and a large city, or, you know, congested location. So there is significant variation based on what DERs can avoid, and having that variation would be quite important to make sure we can cost effectively transition. So I think New York moving from net metering to the value of DER has been probably the biggest successes. And here I'm going to show one more graph, and this is about the environmental value of distributed energy resources. So the environmental value depends on, you know, what generator is being displaced, when it is being displaced, and, you know, what the population exposed to the emissions avoided, and our, you know, this little figure from one of our other reports show that this value is highly time and location dependent. So the rows are different different times: morning, midday, evening, and the columns are seasons. And then we have egret regions. You can see that the value depends significantly, and any policy that tries to leverage its distributed energy resources to reduce emissions, both for CO2 and local pollutants, has to take this into account. New York's VDER approach has different components for energy value, capacity value, distribution level value, and environmental value. And it is not as granular. For example, the environmental value is a fixed value. It is not as granular as I would want, but it is definitely an improvement compared to basic net metering. So these are some examples from like different New York utilities about how the rates for net metering and VDER is changing, but I'm not going to spend too much time on those. What I will say is that, you know, with the recent AMI order of New Jersey BPU, there is a big potential to leverage that AMI data to improve not just retail rates, but also how DERs get compensated. I think leveraging that and using value stacks, especially, and thinking about environmental values, would be a key to achieving energy master plan. Of course, we want, you know, large scale generation, but that is not sufficient. We want distributed energy resources. We want this, you know, demand response. We want the flexibility that demand response or behind the meter resources bring, but those need to align not just with wholesale market values, but also the emissions of PJM. And it is especially important in PJM because you don't want your demand response to reduce peak demand when when a natural gas plant is on the margin at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, but then go and, you know, shift that load to night when you have a coal plant in, I don't know, Ohio, you know, producing that electricity. So this emissions impact especially has to be taken into account. Okay, so I am running out of time, so I'm going to talk about transmission real quick. You know, we need new transmission, and New Jersey Energy Master Plan also talks about that. The same problem is in New York too, especially given the congestion that we have between upstate and downstate. But again, this is an area where coordination and collaboration is needed with the federal government and FERC. Right now, FERC transmission planning is failing, and there's a reform needed at FERC related to Order 1000 transmission planning rules. Better cost benefit analysis is needed, and this is especially crucial for offshore wind transmission, because right now it is not When you think about what we need for offshore wind, we need platforms, we need network offshore wind. That will be the cheapest and most efficient solution. But right now, there is no process that could make that happen. And there have been several complaints at FERC related to those. And it will be important for advocates and generally policymaking community to be cognizant of that fact and try to help reform the process. But it is not just about offshore wind, but it is the coordination of onshore and offshore improvements. You need to think about these again holistically, and New York has been doing some process, but again the key change here has to lie at FERC. Okay, moving on to different sectors. In the building sector, where there, especially in New York City, there are the biggest source of emissions. I'm going to quickly point out some interesting things that are happening. New York City has a local law, Local Law 97, that puts a cap on emissions from large buildings. But New York City also studying whether they could turn this into a cap and trade program. So it will be like RGGI, but for buildings, and that is I think an exciting again, as a person who likes market-based initiatives, I think that is an exciting thing that that New Jersey should be watching. The transportation sector, again, there's transportation and climate initiative that New York is a part of. And so is New Jersey. And then on top of that, there is a congestion pricing program in New York City, which has been delayed a little bit based on the pandemic. And again, there has been some issues, delays, coordinations of city, state, and federal policymakers. But this is also another, again, pricing initiative that would help a lot with both achieving climate goals, but also reducing local pollution. So what are my overall thoughts about all these, patchwork of policies? One, obviously, as an economist, I would love to have an economy-wide carbon price. So you have the same uniform carbon price on every sector, and that will not only correct the externality, but it generates revenue. And I think revenue generating opportunities is especially important at this point, because we need revenue to make sure that this clean energy transition is equitable and inclusive. We need revenue to make sure that we don't increase the energy burden or the environmental burden of communities who have already been burdened by excess pollution, by expensive energy. We need to generate revenue and use that revenue effectively. If we can't have a cross-sector carbon price, I do think these sector-specific carbon prices are an alternative, as long as we have a price on as many sectors as possible. It is great, but then we need to be cognizant that the price levels should be similar, and we need to make sure that we are covering all sources and minimizing cross-sector leakage. And the one conflict that is happening here is that ideally you want to do a cost benefit analysis or a proper economic analysis before figuring out what the cap should be, what the building limits should be. But because there are uncertainty about all these sectors, not knowing how fast NYSO is going to decarbonize is a challenge for figuring out the impacts of LL 97 in New York City, for example, because you don't know how emission intensive electricity is going to be. Similar for a transportation and climate initiative, you're going to charge electric vehicles using your, using grid electricity. You want to have an idea. So kind of the uncertainty about doing these at different sectors is creating a policy challenge, and also that uncertainty is contributing to opposition. At the same time, there is sector-specific technology mandates. Again, these could work, but you have to think about whether that is the most efficient solution or whether we're leaving money on the table because we're not giving the right price signals for innovation, for new resources, and especially with the new federal government, these mandates is going to be a little bit more important to coordinate about, because if federal government has a clean energy standard, a national clean energy standard mandate, then maybe New Jersey doesn't need to worry about getting like electricity sector decarbonized, because federal government is already doing that, and they could redirect those funds to electrify the transportation sector or buildings or increase energy efficiency. So a lot of that coordination needs to happen. And I don't know how New Jersey politics play out, but I'm sure you've seen how New York politics play out between Governor Cuomo and New York City Mayor de Blasio. Sometimes if different things are done at different levels, that could create conflicts not related to the policies. But it is important that those conflicts are minimized, especially at this point. Both federal, state, and local agencies have to move forward, and it could be that we need kind of like a central coordinating agency, or a climate czar, or someone who can make this, some agency who could make this move forward, because there are synergies from the efforts from all different local and state and federal agencies. We just need to coordinate that a little bit better. Information sharing is very important. One of the problems that I've observed in New York REV proceedings or value of DER proceedings is that stakeholders don't have the information they need. Agencies, regulatory agencies, don't have the information they need, whether it is, customer load profiles, or what the marginal unit is, or where the distribution network is congested. So having this information is crucial for cost effectively moving and like targeting investment. Stakeholder involvement is absolutely essential. One of my observations has been that utilities are around the table all the time, and sometimes there's some other stakeholder involvement as well, but we need environmental justice communities around the table. We need low and middle income communities around the table. We need to make sure that this transition happens in an inclusive and equitable way. And for that to happen, the decisions need to be made with all these advocates around the table, and not just unilaterally by the regulatory agencies. And my final observation is that clarity about process and milestone is very important to make sure that the transition is actually happening. There were lots of delays and unclarities or kind of restarts in some of New York's process during REV, and that did delay investment in, for example, distributed energy resources in New York City. They didn't know, the developers didn't know how they were going to get paid, or they didn't even know like when they're going to know what the formula is going to be. So clarity and process and milestone are very important. But I think New Jersey is at a great spot, and they can learn from what not to do from New York and move forward with the some of the better things New York has done. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. I know I threw a lot of information about, a lot of things going on, so feel free to ask me about the specifics um, if one of the policies is more interesting than the other.
Yeah, Burcin, this is Frank, if no one else will jump in out. So you mentioned with respect to offshore wind, I assume you can hear me.
Yes.
You could, the importance of coordinating the offshore wind development with transmission, and that really hasn't happened to date, and peer states are going their own way. And much of your talk was focused in on markets, and transmission planning is obviously related to market outcomes in both directions. But how would you, how could states, or what's a pathway forward to get kind of this lower cost or more optimal mix of transmission and offshore wind across states that are in 3 ISOs and even in some non-ISOs, and this, this strategy of networking versus radio lines and so forth?
So that's a great question, Frank. So this goes back to Order 1000 and FERC. Order 1000 to date has failed to lead to any interregional transmission, project. And I can have a separate seminar on just transmission planning, but I'm not. Essentially, yes, there's a lot the state can do, like thinking about siting or etc. But the key thing is regional and interregional transmission planning is subject to FERC jurisdiction, and that process has been broken. It hasn't been, it was a great experiment, but it didn't work. So that needs to be reformed. And one way would be to states to go start working with FERC on this issue. FERC already recently had an offshore wind technical conference, and Commissioner Glick has been asking a lot of good questions about this. So he is aware of this problem, and he is already looking for solutions. And given that he is the sole Democratic commissioner in the commission right now, I'm assuming that he will be the next FERC chair. So I think there is a good opportunity for states to work with FERC on this to improve offshore wind and general interregional planning. They already have an open docket on other transmission incentives, so they could even have a overall complete revamp of transmission regulation, which I think would be fantastic. Any other questions?
I assume, Burcin, folks can contact you. I mean, you have your email address up there. And it'll be interesting to see how this FRR process at New Jersey unfolds. I know New England is going through a similar, as you talked about New York, but the ISO New England is going through a similar set of this conflict between, in that case, 6 states, a little bit more compact than PJM, but more heterogeneous than New York. And the same issues: capacity, integration of clean energy plans, the MOPR rule. Will that be overturned with the new FERC? If so, how long will that take? Will the federal government, to what extent the federal government will act, and will that alleviate or require more state actions or shifting? So, and the regions obviously interact, what goes on in one ISO, they talk, but it doesn't mean they're in tandem. So I don't know if you have any views about over the region, New York, New England, and PJM in terms of, or is it just now a matter of coordinating within PJM, within ISO, within ISO New England?
Yeah, definitely the similar questions similar questions happen in every RTO, and they each have different challenges, and they decide to go one way or another. But generally, when one ISO does something, or somebody complains about one particular rule in one ISO, that kind of spills over. That has been, especially this MOPR, that spilled over to different ISOs. Like 4 years ago, yes, there were some issues around New York's BSM, but it wasn't as significant. And only after FERC ruled recently to extend MOPR in PJM, somebody in New York said, well, you've done this over there, why are you not doing it over here? So that is kind of challenging. But so watching and learning from different ISOs is a good thing, and especially for transmission planning, that needs to be even at a more higher level, not just PJM NISO conversation, but there has been recently like studies of supergrids, like the from national labs. We need high voltage transmission lines that could bring a lot of renewable resources from one region of the country, whether or not they're in an ISO, to another region. So more coordination is necessary, not just in between ISOs and RTOs, but at a even higher level. I see some questions at the chat, so I can go over those. First question is regarding equity: is giving groups a seat at the table sufficient? If not, what else is needed? Giving groups a seat is necessary, but it is not sufficient. We also need to give these groups the resources to be able to present at the table. I mean, there are a lot of important dockets going on, and most of these organizations, advocacy organizations, are very short-staffed, and I'm sure you recognize how wonky and detailed and these electricity proceedings are. For example, without modeling, in most of the cases, we can't know what a good solution is. So creating an environment where advocates have access to information, access to models, whether it is done by a consulting by the Public Service Commission, or some kind of like a fund that these groups can access to, is I think definitely is necessary. But these groups being at the table, in my opinion, is at the minimum that needs to happen. Without people who are being most affected from these transition being around the table, I don't think we can move forward equitably to what we want, like a clean energy future. There is one more question about would a joint effort by the Port Authority and NYSO PJM be a beneficial structure for transmission planning development progress? Definitely. As I said, the broader the planning process is, the higher, the higher level is, I think it will be important. Once, we can figure out what needs to be built to get clean energy where, then I think that could go down to like smaller regions, whether it is NYSO PJM, ISO New England, or just ISO PJM, Port Authority. I think that will definitely be very beneficial. Those are the last questions I have. So I don't know, Kevin, if you have any other questions on the list in the chat.
No, it looks like there's no more questions in the chat. I want to thank you for joining us today. It was a great presentation, and we appreciate your time. And we hope everyone can join us for our next seminar, which, if I remember correctly, was December 11th. Once again, thank you, Dr. Unel, and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks again for having me.